Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. As Lexi said, my name is Chris Ferris. I'm an IBM Distinguished Engineer, and I'm CTO for Open Technology. This means that I have basically overall technical responsibility for all of the open source and open standards work that we do at IBM. I've been around. I've done a few things. Most recently, I got involved in blockchain. And I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about how that came to pass. But essentially, this is a part of my overall function, and it's actually the part that I tend to enjoy the most. So let's get into it. So let's just make sort of a statement that says that two and a half, 3 years ago, people had been sort of analyzing, understanding this new technology, blockchain, that underpinned Bitcoin and Ethereum. And they looked at the underlying technology and they said, wow, this is kind of important. This is kind of powerful. If we can apply this particular technology and apply the notion of shared, trusted, secure information across even the most, the fiercest competitors, what can we do with that to actually transform the way that industry and business works? And so people started to take a look at how would we apply this blockchain technology to finance, to healthcare, supply chain, IoT, and so forth. So IBM was one of the first companies to sort of latch on to this idea that this technology could be as powerful as any other that had come before when it comes to transforming the enterprise. And IBM is obviously sort of very focused on enterprise consumers and our customers. And so we started doing some experimentation, some investigation into this underlying technology. And we started to explore, so maybe we should get involved in some of these communities, right? And we had some people in IBM research that were actually actively looking at the technology itself and saying, well, we could write one of these, we could do an implementation. And this is where I got involved, as being CTO for Open Technology. I caught wind of this activity and I said, look guys, if IBM is going to come out with IBM blockchain and it's only an IBM thing, it's never going to succeed, right? It's going to be a big, huge flop, because why would anybody trust an only IBM thing, right? It's no different than trying to get everybody to use DB2 or WebSphere. It's not going to happen. This is a technology that, by its very definition, requires that it be adopted by everybody. And we're not going to all adopt an IBM technology any more than we would all adopt a Microsoft or an Oracle or anybody else's technology. And so there's a huge potential behind this, but I was advocating inside IBM, but it's only going to be successful if it's truly open. It has to be open, has to be developed under open governance. It cannot be controlled by any one vendor, any one company, any one individual. So, as I mentioned, we started exploring this, and we did look around, and we actually investigated the potential of, well, let's just sort of partner up with the guys at Ethereum. But the guys at Ethereum and the Ethereum Foundation at the time were really very focused on what I would call sort of crypto-anarchists, right? They had no interest whatsoever in solving problems for the enterprise, right? They were focused on permissionless blockchain, anonymous transactions, and so forth. And so we started to sort of say, well, okay, so we probably should take this out, deliver some technology into an open source community. And we have to solve a lot of problems here, right? And the best way to do that is to engage others in the community, other vendors, other individuals, scientists, researchers, to solve problems of how do we solve the problem of limited throughput, right? You think about Bitcoin, think about Ethereum, and the transaction rates that you can achieve with those two technologies, right? 7 to 10 transactions a second for Bitcoin. Yes, there's active work on trying to figure out how do we push the envelope on that, right? But those solutions are still focused on being public, permissionless, and so forth. Latency to confirmation, right? You think about using using a cryptocurrency, using blockchain technology to do retail sales. And so you go in with your wallet and you pay for your item, and then they say, go wait in the corner for 2 hours while the transaction settles, right? You can't leave the store because we're not sure of whether or not you really paid for it yet. No, that's not going to work. Anonymity, right? When we talk to consumers, enterprise consumers, potential enterprise consumers of blockchain technology, the anonymity aspects didn't work for them. You talk about banks and securities firms, and they have strict know your customer regulation requirements. You have to understand who your customer is, and you have to collect all kinds of information on them, make sure that they're not terrorists that are doing money laundering or something like that, right? So anonymity doesn't work for them. You need to understand who your customer is. So you can't just have an account number. You have to understand who's behind that account. Privacy. So yes, you take a look at their permissionless public blockchains, and everything's anonymous, and so therefore you can't really tell who's doing what to whom, but you can analyze patterns. And you can see all the data, right? It's all right out there in the open. And the reality is, in business, while we do want to be able to sort of start building out trust using this technology, we still need to have privacy, right? If you're a securities firm and you're starting to make moves in the market, you don't want your competitors to see which securities you're purchasing, because they'll just get in front of you and start arbitraging that security and make you pay more while they're making money off your trades. So privacy is really fundamentally important in many regards. If I'm doing supply chain, if I'm doing supply chain kind of solution, I don't necessarily want all of the members of that supply chain to understand that I'm giving you a special deal on those widgets, right? That's something between you and I don't want everybody else to know, otherwise everybody else is going to want in on that deal, right? So privacy is important. So then we have the question of, well, how do we achieve that, right? The other part of bringing blockchain technology to the enterprise was the cryptocurrency aspect. Most of those public permission blockchain technologies required a cryptocurrency and required some form of mining to do to engineer consensus. And that scares the bejesus out of a lot of enterprise customers. They just didn't want to think about the prospect of, in the Ethereum context, for instance, having their share of Ether hacked and taken away from them that prevented them from running their smart contracts. That's not something that any CISO is going to be willing to sort of live with. No finality. We talked about the latency, but then there's a whole aspect of, okay, so let's say I'm using this in the context of securities trades, and then somebody decides, you know what, we're going to fork the network because we didn't like the fact that this trade happened over here, and we're just going to vote it off the island, right? That's not something that's realistic from an enterprise perspective. There has to be finality. And then finally, there was the governance aspect of things. And you take a look at the issues that the technical community in Bitcoin are having, and just trying to figure out how do we increase the block size so that we can get transactions to process more quickly. And they can't make a technical change, because there's too much pent-up demand because it's going to affect the value of Bitcoin. And there's too many miners with all this Bitcoin that are going to, no, you're not changing that. So the governance was really a problem. It hadn't really been thought through initially. But I think the intention, again, for the permissionless blockchains had been, we don't want no stinking governance. But I think that's, so our challenge, oh, no, this isn't our challenge. That's somebody else's challenge, to go boldly where no man has gone before. No, our challenge was to achieve consensus at scale, right? At the same sort of scale that we have with public permission blockchains, with high transaction throughput to satisfy enterprise-type requirements. I mean, you think about it, 7 transactions a second. That's not, I mean, if you're doing any kind of enterprise IT at all, how many transactions per second are you going to need? Thousands of transactions per second. With sufficiently low latency, right? So you need to be able to do these transactions, and they need to be committed in a reasonably short period of time, right, to meet those enterprise needs. And how do you do that with privacy, right? How do you engineer privacy in all of that without sort of having the whole house of cards fall down upon you, right? So we have an awful lot of technical challenges that we have to solve. And the only way that we can really do that effectively, I think, is to do it together. So I used to work at Sun Microsystems, as I said in the intro. And I used to work with a guy called Bill Joy, who was the chief scientist over at Sun Microsystems at the time. You know, many people can sort of thank him for all of his technology innovations, but this is the one sort of aspect of Bill that I take away, and that is, no matter who you are, no matter how big your company is, no matter how many smart people you employ in your big company, most of the smartest people work for somebody else. So, with that in mind, is any one party going to be able to sort of, I'm gonna disrupt all y'all, right? I'm gonna deliver, you know, solution on all this blockchain stuff all by myself. Now, that's not realistic, right? So we wanted to sort of take this technology, take those challenges to the open community and help to create an environment where we could solve those problems together, right? And this is how the Hyperledger Foundation was established. As I mentioned, I was talking with the researchers and so forth in IBM saying, we need to make this open source, and they said, okay, go do that. So I called up my good friend Jim Zemlin at the Linux Foundation. He's the executive director at the Linux Foundation. I said, hey, Jim, I got this idea for starting up a blockchain project at the Linux Foundation. And I started to give him my pitch about, you know, what blockchain was and why it was important and how it related to the enterprise and so forth. And he just started laughing. I'm like, Jim, we're friends. You're laughing at me. What's the deal? He goes, no, Chris, you don't understand. He says, you're about the 8th person that's come to me and proposed to have a blockchain project at the Linux Foundation. And I said, oh, crap. And I said, so, okay. So he says, but yours is the first proposal that makes any sense. He says, a lot of those other ones are people would come in and they wouldn't even tell me who they were because they wanted to be anonymous, right? You know. And then it's like some of these people I certainly was not going to trust, right? But you, I know you, I trust IBM, I understand IBM's sort of commitment to open technology, open source. And he says, this makes tons of sense. Let's go do this. And so this is how the Hyperledger Foundation is born. For those who doesn't know what Linux is, right? Everybody knows what Linux is, right? So nobody's raising their hand. Good, right? So you probably heard of the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation does more than just the Linux kernel, though, right? There's actually over 60 what we call collaborative projects at the Linux Foundation. And Hyperledger is one of the more recent ones. Our goals are pretty straightforward, right? Our objective is to create open source technology around blockchain and distributed ledger technologies for business, right? This is not developing the next ICO. This is not about developing some new cryptocurrency. This is about developing blockchain technology for the enterprise. To, you know, essentially help enable and foster open infrastructures, pluggable, modular, componentized, to build out technical communities around that technology, right, through meetups and various other conference engagements and so forth, educating the public about what we're doing in Hyperledger, and then promoting those communities in venues such as this one here. Our leadership, well, aside from that ugly guy in the middle, we have Brian Bellendorf, who's been around the block for a few times. Brian was one of the original committers of the Apache HTTP server. He helped to found the Apache Foundation. He worked at Mozilla for a while. He worked at the World Economic Forum. He was in venture capital at the time that we established Hyperledger. And he came to one of our early, well, we call them Hackfests. This is where we get the members of the Hyperledger Technical Community together, and he showed up and he says, it was funny, he was just telling this story last night, and I thought it was really a pretty good one. He says, so he shows up and he says, it kind of felt like, the 45-year-old who shows up at the skate park with a board and brand new knee pads that aren't scuffed up and everything, and he's looking around at all these kids running around doing backflips and stuff on their skateboards, and he says, here, hold my beer. I'm going to show you how it's done. And I felt good about that because I was 59 when I started the Hyperledger Foundation. And so being told I would look like I was 45 felt good. But anyway, so Brian is our executive director. He's been fantastic. The board chair for Hyperledger is Blythe Masters. Does everybody know who Blythe Masters is? Everybody heard of her before? Some people have. She's a pretty big deal in Wall Street. She actually was the one who created the credit default swap. So we can thank her for that. No, but she's really quite brilliant, and she's really quite a powerhouse. And so she's got a startup called Digital Asset Holdings that's working on blockchain technology, and she was one of the early partners with IBM. So she's been really fantastic as our board chair. And then we have Dan O'Prey also from Digital Assets, and Hannah Zubko. Does anybody know Hannah from Intellect EU? Some people do. Good. She's fantastic. She's fantastic. And then there's that idiot in the middle who is the chair of the Technical Steering Committee, and that would be me. We have a very diverse membership. So this is not just a vendor play, right? We have technology vendors like IBM and Fujitsu and Hitachi. We have an Intel, SAP. We have securities firms like JP Morgan. We have Amex. We have supply chain represented by the likes of Airbus. We have healthcare represented by a company called Change Healthcare. They actually process like 1/3 of all the insurance claims in the country in the United States. I had no idea who they were. This is important. They're using the technology we're developing in Hyperledger to process those claims. Cisco. We have Daimler, right? Deutsche Bank. TradeShift for supply chain integration. I mean, it's really, and then we have two companies from China in our premier membership, Baidu and Wanda. So, again, this is a very diverse set of leaders in this community that have sort of helped to drive this to become the fastest growing project ever at the Linux Foundation. Now, the Linux kernel itself is huge. We're not that big yet. But in terms of the growth spurt, right, in terms of that initial expansion, nothing at the Linux Foundation has ever grown as quickly. So we're in just a little over 2 years now, almost 2.5 years, we've grown to over 260 members. There are now 10 projects under either incubation or active projects at the Hyperledger. We've had 2 projects go through production releases, and in fact, I'm in the process right now of helping to cut the 3rd production release of Hyperledger Fabric. Hopefully that'll be Tuesday. It was supposed to be today, but we ran into a slight glitch. We have to do another couple of days worth of testing. 3.5 million lines of code, all right? And the actual number of lines of code that have been contributed and rewritten and removed and so forth is well over 5 million. It's really pretty impressive. 44,000 commits. There's an awful lot of activity going on in all these projects, is what I'm really trying to tell you. There are over 500 engineers working on the 10 projects that we have going at Hyperledger right now. I know that there is a little bit of a myth. Some people have been sort of trying to give you the impression that Hyperledger equal IBM. No. IBM's maybe 20%. Now, it's a lot, but it's not all IBM. It's mostly others. We've had 100,000 people sign up and enroll for our first sort of education course, something we call a MOOC, massively online open source course, something like that, I think it stands for. And almost a little bit over 4,000 people have completed that course thus far. It takes about 4 weeks to complete, so it's not like people are dropping out. It just means you have to invest a bit of time to actually get through the course. And then there's the whole community and ecosystem engagement aspect of things, right? So we have Brian and myself and others in the community going out, speaking at conferences, speaking at meetups. We just had a meetup last night, hosted by ABN AMRO, engaging the broader community, trying to get others that are working on some of these technology innovations around blockchain to come and join us in Hyperledger, bring their project to Hyperledger, because it's building out this community where we can build off of each other's innovations that we're really going to see the greatest amount of technical innovation. Everything we do is also open. So I host a technical steering committee every week, Thursdays, 10 o'clock Eastern time in the US. It's open to everybody. The calls are recorded, so if you can't make the call, you can always listen in and hear what went on. And we publish the minutes in addition to the audio recordings. All the presentations and so forth that are made are all open. Anybody is welcome to come and participate. You don't have to be a member. Everybody is welcome because it's open source. And you think about the ecosystem that this project, this collection of projects, I should say, has been able to grow. You know, we're over 60 different companies now part of this sort of broad ecosystem of delivering some aspect of the Hyperledger technology to their consumers, right? Some of them are delivering blockchain as a service like IBM and Microsoft. It's not even on this list, but they've got an offering. Amazon's got an offering, right? Oracle. And then you've got a number of smaller companies that are delivering either solutions for their clients, a number of global ISV solution providers, you know, the Accentures, the Deloittes, Ernst & Young, and so forth, all working on delivering various aspects of this. And we've done this in just over 2 years. It's really it's phenomenal. So I want to take a little bit of a brief note. So, you know, again, so this is all cool. This is wonderful. We're building out this vibrant community, this vibrant ecosystem. What are people doing with it? So back in 2016, when we were starting all of this, you had every CTO in the world had their hair on fire saying, oh my God, I have to do blockchain, right? And they were doing this because their CEO was saying, I want you to out-innovate everybody else, and we're going to disrupt all y'all. That's what they say in the South. We're going to disrupt you and all of our competitors, and we're going to beat them with some blockchain thing. Something, 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 right? That's their business model, right? So we've done, you know, IBM has done a zillion proof of concepts, discussions with customers that all came with that same sort of notion of, I need you to help me understand blockchain because then I'm going to develop something top-secret-y and we're going to disrupt the whole healthcare industry, or we're going to disrupt the whole finance industry, or we're going to disrupt banking, whatever it is. And so they'd go through and they'd do a POC, and then they'd say, I got this cool thing, and I'm going to make it. Oh, wait, nobody wants to play in my sandbox that I'm going to control and beat them up with, right? Here's what I'm trying to say here. The systems that are in production now, we're here talking about Rethink Trust. The systems that are in production now on Hyperledger technology, Hyperledger Fabric or Sawtooth or what have you, are the ones that got together and they established trust not from a technology, but by building a consortium of like-minded, interested parties, all with the goal of saying, yeah, let's transform our industry together, right? So WeTrade is a classic example. They're doing supply chain, trade finance, I should say. Again, this is a group that got together. It's going to grow. But they said, no, it's not like one of us is going to come in and we're going to innovate you all out of business. Said, no, let's get together and let's innovate, let's transform this industry, let's make it better, and let's all benefit from that. Another one, food trust. Everybody knows who Walmart is. Walmart's huge. Why can't they just, I'm going to just put a blockchain thing in, I'm going to make all of my suppliers do blockchain the Walmart way. Well, Walmart tried that with RFID and it didn't work out so well. They learned their lesson. Walmart came to IBM and they said, we need your help. We need to figure out how can we talk to our competitors, right? How do we talk to our competitors to solve the problem of food trust? And what I mean by food trust is the ability, for instance, to find out where did this salmonella and chicken come from, or where did this E. coli lettuce come from? And be able to trace back where did this which farm was this sourced from, so that we can find the source of that and fix the problem. And so we got them together with the Nestle's and the Tysons and the Dole Foods and Unilevers and Kroger's. In this case, both supply chain partners and competitors. Because they recognize that we're going to have to solve this collectively. We're going to have to build trust, build a consortium, and then the technology is going to do something for us. Trusted identity, another example, is SecureKey in Canada. And they had this idea, but again, they aren't going to be able to sort of provide identity and sort of capture that whole market. The only way it's going to be able to happen is if all the banks in Canada got together and said, yeah, this is how we're going to solve identity in the finance industry in Canada, right? They had to get all of them together and build trust first, then the technology is going to help them after the fact. So, talk about building trust again. Talk about the theme of my talk, which is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Hyperledger itself, from a technology perspective, it's an experiment in building trust, so that we can actually get together and collaborate as technologists without thinking that the other one's trying to get the other guy, right? So the first project that we incubated at Hyperledger was Hyperledger Fabric. This was an IBM contribution. Again, as I mentioned, we've been working on this in IBM research. We had some technology. We wanted to bring it into open source. So we incubated this project. We called it Fabric. We actually collaborated with digital assets to sort of build that initial seed of trust, if you will, to get the community to agree that, yeah, let's start with this as an initial starting point. Well, then Intel came along and they said, hey, we got smart people in our research lab too. We've got something called Sawtooth. It was called Sawtooth Lake at the time. Similar. Again, modular, composable, configurable. And they had a very innovative approach to doing consensus that the researchers in IBM had not conceived of before. They called it proof of elapsed time. They sort of turned proof of work on its head and said, okay, so we have these SGX chips, these trusted execution environments, these enclaves. What if we just sort of, instead of proof of work where you have to compute a hash and spend a whole lot of energy in doing that computation, what if you just sort of went to sleep for a random period of time, wake up, win the lottery? Well, that's what they came up with initially. So they had some really interesting innovations in Sawtooth. Initially, though, these two technologies were sort of competing. It was weird. They didn't trust each other. Oh, the IBM guys, they just want to do mainframe stuff, right? Intel, we just want to do Intel stuff. Well, I'll explain how this story ends well. So then we had another project coming in from a company called DTCC. They do the trade clearing in the United States securities markets. And they said, well, these technologies are really cool, but something that's missing is some ability to sort of go in and inspect and see how high is my block, how high is my blockchain? What's the block height? What do the transactions look like? What's the throughput? How can I sort of visualize what's going on inside this network? And so they started building out, and they built something called Explorer that was intended to sort of plug into either Sawtooth or Fabric and sort of take a look at what's going on inside. Cool. Then we had a fintech startup in Japan called Suramitsu, along with NTT Data and some other researchers in Japan, bring a project called Roha. It was another similar, they'd been working on this in the fintech market in Japan. It's written in C++, Fabric was Go, Sawtooth is Python at the time. So yet another flavor. But it gets better. So then IBM had been also working on sort of building out a sort of a front-end development environment for developing applications for Hyperledger Fabric. And so IBM contributed Hyperledger Composer as another project with the intent that potentially Composer could be made to work with Sawtooth or Roha. Then we had some engineers in China who'd been working on sort of wanting to have blockchain as a service deployments to deploy Sawtooth or Fabric or Roha or what have you. And they built an initial project that was focused on deploying networks, blockchain as a service networks, and they developed something called Hyperledger Cello, and they incubated that. So again, a little bit more collaborations going on, a little bit more focus on how do we help these others. Now, a lot of people would say Hyperledger and Ethereum are somehow or other competing with one another. I'm here to tell you that's a bunch of bullshit. In fact, we actually tried in early 2016, actually in the summer of 2016, we were working behind the scenes within some people within the Ethereum community to try to get the Ethereum C++ client relicensed as Apache and bring it to Hyperledger. Hyperledger, everything we're doing in Hyperledger is licensed with Apache software license. All the Ethereum stuff is mostly GPL. GPL is like this in the enterprise. But we had a company called Monax, which had previously been called Eris, and they had a product called ErisDB. They renamed Burrow. So now we have our first Ethereum-based project in Hyperledger. What am I doing on time? Good. Identity. So we're chugging along. This is about, I don't know, I think we're pushing towards the end of last year. And the Sovereign Foundation approached us, and Evernym, and they said, we've got this project to do self-sovereign identity, and we'd like to bring it to Hyperledger. Well, this is great because everything, all these solutions, Sawtooth, Fabric, Burrow, Roha, they're permissioned blockchain systems. They need identity. And it's one thing to have a permission system and have some sort of a certificate authority. This is the approach that Fabric takes, for instance. But those are hard to manage. And they are decentralized. Everybody can have their own. But wouldn't it be cool if we actually had total decentralization of identity as well and plug that in to these various other systems? So everybody was like, oh, wow, this is cool. We like that. Let's bring that on board. And then we had our first stab at interoperability. Some engineers at Ripple had been working on for the past 3-4 years now on something called the Interledger Protocol, ILP. It's an open standard being developed sort of at the W3C. And they said, we have a Java implementation. We'd love to bring that to Hyperledger and have it developed there. So we brought Quilt on board. And then, finally, we had some engineers in China from Huawei who'd been, working with some clients of theirs in China and elsewhere, and a lot of the, questions were, well, what's the performance of these platforms? How many, transactions per second? What's the latency and so forth? And so they started developing a benchmarking framework that could measure performance, measure apples on apples between Sawtooth and Fabric and Burrow and so forth. And so they proposed to incubate a project called Caliper. Now, we had just formed a working group to focus on performance and scale because everybody wants to know this, but there are no formal benchmarks for blockchain, right? There's no, it's not like there's a spec out there for doing blockchain performance benchmarking. And so we said, well, we need you to get to work with the working group to sort of make sure that we're all singing out of the same hymn book and that we're all on the same page in terms of what are the metrics we're going to be measuring, how are those things measured, and then we can have a framework that goes off and tests these various platforms. So Caliper was born. So that's the Hyperledger greenhouse, right? And this, again, but we still had the problem that, for the most part, Sawtooth, Fabric, Burrow, they're independent projects. There's a lot of similarities between them, some differences, some innovations. The nice thing is they're all licensed under the Apache software license, which means that the intellectual property that we contribute in is shared by everybody. All right? This is the positive effect of having open governance and having a sensible IP policy. So initially there was sort of a congregation of these tool projects that are focusing on, and again, I'm showing Hyperledger Fabric here, there's others, but my point here is that there's sort of like, okay, so let's help grow this project through other side projects, through other tools, right? Let's build it out. Let's start building a community around that. And then, late last year, just after Burrow had joined, and I said, Ethereum has been interesting to people in Hyperledger for a long time. Most of the platforms that we're building are very modular, very componentized, and the smart contracts are typically pluggable. And right now, Solidity and the follow-on, Ethereum virtual machine languages are the ones that developers are most familiar with. I'm not saying that they're necessarily going to be the ones that everybody ends up with, but there's a huge potential to attract developers that have been working in public Ethereum, but then when they go to their CTO or their CISO and they say, hey, I want to put this project into production, and they get laughed out of the office because, are you kidding me? No, I'm not going to put my production application on Ethereum public network and be worried about whether the gas that I'm using to fuel my smart contract for this application could get hacked. No. I need you to find me an enterprise Ethereum thingy. And there is an enterprise Ethereum association that's working on standards and specs for what that might look like, but there's a few implementations. In fact, well, long story, I won't get into it, but we've been trying to bring those into Hyperledger as well. Anyway, but there's Burrow. And so we started having some talks between the projects. Finally, we're starting to sort of break out behind our little fiefdoms, and we're starting to collaborate across projects. How can we take the Burrow Ethereum virtual machine component, the package, the Go package in Burrow, and integrate that into Sawtooth and Fabric? And in fact, we've successfully worked with Burrow to help them reshape, to refactor the Go package that is the Ethereum virtual machine package inside Burrow, to remove the Burrowisms, if you will, and make a generally pluggable component that's now I'm delivering in Fabric 1.2, a chain code, that's our smart contract thingy in Fabric, a chain code that implements the Burrow EVM so you can run Ethereum smart contracts directly on Fabric with all the beautiful permissioning and endorsement policies and all those cool things that we have in Fabric. And you can do that and use an Ethereum smart contract. And the same thing with Sawtooth. Sawtooth has done essentially the same thing, and they have a project called Seth. So we're starting to build trust between these projects. This is where the magic happens, right? This is where we start innovating, where we start building on each other's successes rather than trying to compete against one another. This is the same thing as when you get industry participants in the same industry getting together and forming a consortium and saying, let's solve this problem together, right, rather than trying to solve it independently and beat each other with it. Identity, I mentioned, everybody needs identity, and I toyed around with this chart a little bit. It was like I was going to put little hearts and stuff, but that's not me. But everybody loves identity, right? Everybody needs identity. And so we're looking at this from two perspectives. How do we take Indy's verifiable claims and use those as identity inside Fabric and Sawtooth and Burrow and so forth? But we're also looking at, now Indy is sort of two parts. There's an underlying, they have built their own bespoke distributed ledger in order to record the identity in the blockchain. They actually record only the anchors for the identity, not the actual identity itself is on the blockchain. Can you run Indy on top of Fabric, Sawtooth, Burrow, Aroha? And so we have active engagement with the folk in the Indy community on trying to do exactly that. Because Indy, the sovereign guys, they don't care. They don't actually want to manage and maintain a blockchain platform. They'd love to use somebody else's. So what's next? So, I mentioned that, we've just been having I don't remember how many we've had now. It's about 8. Maybe Hyperledger Hackfest hosted by ABN AMRO just outside the city. And I was just commenting to Brian yesterday, this one seems special. This is the one where we're really starting to get to the point where the engineers are no longer trying to sort of one-up each other. They're trying to figure out how do they work together. I was talking with one of the engineers from Sawtooth yesterday, and we're both working on integrating Raft-based consensus module in Fabric and Sawtooth. Why don't we do this together? Why don't we build one module that we can share rather than each of us build a Raft consensus component? That's silly, right? And it goes beyond that, right? So IBM has been working on some zero-knowledge proof capabilities that we're going to be adding into Fabric, something we call zero-knowledge asset transfers. And but there's the same zero-knowledge proof crypto libraries that we're using are very interesting to the Indy guys. And so we've been talking with Indy, and we've been talking, thanks. We've been talking with the Sawtooth guys as well about sharing this. And so there's now a crypto-lib project that's cooking up and is likely to happen. That'll be the sort of the synergy of these various technologies. My point here is that I think we've finally broken through and we've started to establish that trust amongst the development community. And we'd love to have more people come and join us, right? I'm still encouraging, every time I see Joe Lubin, I say, come on down. We don't bite, right? We want to help, we want to collaborate. We'd love to have, Quorum 2.0 or whatever they're building over there at Consensus in Hyperledger, right? Gartner has said in many of their analysis that the blockchain for enterprise technology that's going to win doesn't exist today. And I think they're right. Now, I think it exists in some form of some combinational, aspect of all the stuff that's out there today, plus some other things, some other innovations. But I think that innovation is going to happen in Hyperledger, and that's my talk. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.